And good morning, everybody. How are you doing out there in virtual land? Quick sound check. Can you hear me well enough? Hello, everybody. Hello, SRS TV. Just a quick check in to tell me that you're doing well. It's good to see everybody. I hope you had a great weekend. Is the sound coming along well? Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. SRS TV, is that where you work? That looks pretty interesting. Nicole, doing well. Yeah, I am jealous of people who are getting the snow. Fantastic. Okay. Great. Good to see everybody. Hope you had a great holiday weekend, got your first homework assignment done. I was actually a little disappointed to see the number of people who didn't complete the first homework. If you're one of those people, please reach out and contact me so we can talk about something. Um, I'm going to try to have those things graded by today. If not today, I will have them graded by tomorrow. But be sure to do your homework every week. That's the major key to success in this class. Don't forget, we'll be having webinar on tonight at 8 p.m. Tonight is the late webinar night. And we'll also be having webinar at 7 p.m. on Thursday for those who cannot make it uh, who cannot make it tonight. If you can't make it either of those, don't forget to do the discussion board. Oh, it's Imani Rasul. Okay, fantastic. Well, good to see you. Thanks for coming. Good morning, Trevor. Fantastic. Looks like we've got a good house. A good number of people in the house today. Look at that, crawling up to 16. We may even get to 20 before this broadcast is over. So let's go ahead and talk about the biology of psychology today. How many of you have ever seen a black widow spider? Do any of you know what a black widow spider is? Those of you who live in the southeast and have grown up in the southeast with me definitely know what one is. They're a very dangerous spider, and they have their venom is a neurotoxin. It's a neurotoxin, and it works by affecting the functioning of the neurons in your brain and nervous system. And hopefully, by the end of today, you will be able to understand how a black widow spider's venom, it's called a laterotoxin, how it affects the functioning of the neuron. Yes, that is the one with the red dot on the back. Very good, SRS or Imani. Fantastic. Good to see everybody. Luke, Kayla, great, fantastic. Let's go ahead and get started with the lecture, shall we? Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the organization of the nervous system. We're going to talk about the anatomy and the physiology of the neurotransmitter. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters and how psychoactive drugs and neurotoxins affect the nervous system. And then we're briefly going to mention hormones as one form of neural communication. So, if we can, let's go ahead and get started. Okay. For those of you who have any questions about today's lecture, some of the things I'm going to be talking about are animated activities that occur in the living neuron. And it may be hard for me to get across exactly what I'm trying to get across in lecture over YouTube. So if you have any questions today or want any more detail on how the nervous system functions, I've got several 2-minute neuroscience videos in the course resources folder this week that you should check out, and they'll do a good job at sort of helping you understand what I'm talking about today. Okay, oh, there goes my picture. Okay, I'm back. All right. Briefly speaking, let me see. Oh, goodness me. Hold on just a second. Let me see. Hold on just a second. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Oh, come on. Chapter 2B. Crudola. Okay. Give me 2 seconds. Let's see, lessons. Uh-huh. I think I've got the wrong PowerPoint loaded, and I don't want that. Let's see what we got here. Good morning, Zara. Good morning, uh, Richard. It's good to, Sarah, Chloe. It's good to see everybody. Let me see. Huh, huh. That is not the one I wanted. Oh, well. Looks like we're going to have to go with it anyhow, aren't we? Yep. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll do what we can do. All right, so let's briefly talk about the nervous system. Oh, man, this is a bummer. Oh, wait a minute. I know where it is. I know exactly where it is. That is certainly the one I want. Let me see. Give me just a second, folks. Okay. Do. Hold on. Dadgummit. Ah, this is the one I want. Hold on, folks. I'm sorry. Take me just a second. Got the wrong stinking. There we go. Let's go to our slide deck. We're going to replace these slides with some better slides. At least what I think are some better slides. Let's see. To a autosave. Okay, here we go. All right, boom. Back to the party. Ooh, let's get back to that. Okay. All right. Here's the deal. Neurons and glial cells. Now, your nervous system is the part of your body that is responsible for receiving information, evaluating, integrating that information, and providing adaptive responses for you, the human being. Your nervous system is composed of two basic types of cells: neurons and glial cells. Neurons and glial cells. Okay. Neurons are the one-way communication cells that transmit information from your brain to your body and from your body to your brain and from all over your brain to one another to different areas. They're present in birth and come in all shapes and sizes. The primary function of a neuron is to transmit information, a brief pulse of electricity from point A to point B in your body. They're one way routes of communication that connect one part of the nervous system to other parts of the nervous system or body. One end of the neuron is sensitive to chemicals called neurotransmitters that are secreted by other neurons. And when a neuron is stimulated by neurotransmitters, it may generate a pulse of electrical activity we call an action potential uh, that travels down the length of the neuron. I see we're getting a statement in the chat bar about the PowerPoint. Is the PowerPoint fuzzy for everybody? Please give me a little bit of feedback there. When stimulated by uh, neurotransmitters, a neuron may generate a pulse of electrical activity that travels. So that's basically what a brain does. Part of your one neuron will secrete a chemical, it'll stimulate another neuron, which will then generate a pulse of electrical activity that travels to a different part of your nervous system. Now, you've got about 85 to 100 billion neurons in your nervous system. So they say. I have no idea who possibly counted those, right? But the one thing we do know is that you have even more glial cells. Glial cells. Glial comes from the Greek word for glue. And these are the support cells for neurons that kind of hold your nervous system together. It turns out that there are 10 times as many glial cells as there are neurons in your nervous system. Your glial cells develop postnatally, that is, they develop after you're born. So when you're born, you have all the neurons you're going to need, but you have very few of the glial cells that you need. And so what happens is these glial cells actually are produced and generated after birth. And this is why infants are so helpless. Their glial cells really make the nervous system function well. And as people develop their glial cells during the first 2 to 5 years of life, you'll notice they go from helpless infants to little 5-year-olds that run around and look just like many adults. Okay? Now, they develop postnatally after you're born, and they have two sort of main jobs. They clean up intracellular waste and they speed up nerve signals. If you look right below me, what you're going to see are some neurons, a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and a pyramidal neuron that you're going to see mostly in your cerebellum. That's this back part of your brain. And then if you look down below those, you'll see astrocytes and microglia, which are and Betz cells, which are glial cells that act as support structures for neurons. Okay, now here's the deal. If you look at these neurons, and glial cells, what you're going to notice is that you can organize them into two sort of basic structures. You've got what we would call the central nervous system, which is the neurons that make up the brain and spinal column. If you look over my picture over here, you'll notice that we have a brain and a spinal column, and they're in pink and red. And they're in pink and red to differentiate them from the neurons that you will find in your peripheral nervous system. They're peripheral, they're outside this central area. And these are the neurons that connect your CNS, your brain, and your spinal cord to the rest of your body. Now, the central nervous system is composed of the brain, which controls muscles, organs, and higher mental processes. So your brain is controlling your heartbeat, even though you don't think about it. Your brain is controlling your stomach. Your brain is allowing you to process the information that I'm talking about right now. And if you choose to close your laptop and get up and walk away from this lecture, it's your brain that's controlling that. On the other hand, we have a spinal column, and your spinal column is really most responsible for processing reflex responses. So if you've ever been to a doctor and had that checkup where they take that little rubber hammer and hit you on your knee, and your knee little bounces out a little bit, that reflex is controlled by your spinal column. So think of your brain and your spinal column as being central because they receive information and they process and respond to that information. On the other hand, your peripheral nervous system is just neurons that go from your brain to all parts of your body. So your brain can feel your finger. So the nerve that runs from your finger to your spinal column is in the peripheral nervous system. Now you can think of these neurons as being of two classes. All right, there are somatic nerves and there are autonomic nerves. The somatic nerves are the nerves that control your musculature, your body. We call them somatic because they relate to your body functions. So if you lift your arm voluntarily, it's a neuron in your somatic nervous system that controls that. On the other hand, you have a set of nerves that go to your internal organs. These are beyond your voluntary control. You can't really think about making your heart beat faster or your stomach work better, but these two organs are being controlled by your brain and spinal cord. So the nerves that go to these internal organs, we typically refer to as the autonomic nervous system. And when we get to chapter 11 and start talking about stress and coping, I'm going to go into detail on how the autonomic nervous system functions. All right. Now, here's the deal. You folks have probably heard of a nerve before. Okay, nerves and tracts. This is a way of describing a bundle of neurons. A nerve, what we typically refer to as a nerve, is not a neuron. It's not one neuron. A nerve is a bundle of neurons. And if you look at this picture I have over here on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a bundle of neurons, these long, skinny neurons, these long, skinny cells. And you'll see that there's a bunch of them, and they have little blue in the middle. And then if you notice the yellow around each one of these blue, each neuron is in blue, and it's sort of a long wire, if you will. And you notice that around each neuron is this yellow coating. That's actually the glial cells that grow around neurons and support them. Okay, now typically when they talk, remember neurons are one-way roads. So if you want to communicate to your finger from your brain and tell your finger to lift, that goes along a bundle of motor nerves. Motor nerves go from the CNS, the central nervous system, to activate parts of the body. And if you want to feel what your finger is touching, that information travels up along your sensory nerve to your central nervous system. So remember, neurons can only transmit information one way. So in order to control and feel your finger, you have to have two nerves, a motor nerve that goes from your brain to your finger, and a sensory nerve that comes from your from your finger to your brain. Now, we're going to differentiate nerves, which are a bundle of neurons in the peripheral nervous system, with these things called tracts. And a tract is a bundle of neurons. The only difference between a nerve and a tract is that a nerve is a bundle of neurons in your body, and a tract is a bundle of neurons in your brain. So, for example, parts of your brain communicate with one another along bundles of neurons. And so these are tracts. One of them is called the retinohypothalamic tract. That won't be on your exam. I just wanted to show off a big word, right? But the retinohypothalamic tract is actually a bundle of nerves that goes from your eye to your hypothalamus that tells you how much light there is outside so you'll know when to go to bed. And so when there's a lot of light out, your retinohypothalamic tract is sending messages to your hypothalamus telling it it's still daytime. Don't start going to sleep. But when the light goes away at night and your retinohypothalamic tract is no longer sending messages to your hypothalamus decides that it's nighttime and starts your nighttime sleeping process. Okay. Now, instead of using the word motor and sensory neurons, we're going to use the terms afferents and efferents. Okay. And each part of your brain has what we call afferents, that is, neurons transmitting information to it. That's an afferent. And each part of your brain generates action potentials that go to somewhere else in your brain, and those are called efferents. Okay, and so you can think of an afferent as a sensory nerve in the brain, and you can think of an efferent as a sensory nerve in the brain. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to talk more about the sleep and wake cycle next week when we get to chapter 3. So you don't have to worry too much about the retinohypothalamic tract or the hypothalamus just yet, but that's coming next week. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and break down one of these neurons. So I've suggested to you that the neurons in the glial cells make up our entire nervous system and allow us to respond and to react to our environment. We have neurons and we have glial cells. Remember, any neuron that's in your brain or spinal cord is what we call the central nervous system, and any neuron that's outside of your brain or spinal cord is what we would call a, uh, the peripheral nervous system. Now, let's actually scroll in on one individual neuron and talk about sort of the anatomy and physiology of the neurotransmitter. Okay, now, so if you look at the picture below me, this is what they call the prototypical neuron. Turns out neurons come in all shapes and sizes. Not a lot of them look like the one in the picture below, but this is the one that you're typically going to find in an introductory psych class. You know, some neurons are microscopic that you can barely see. Some neurons actually have axons, which we're going to talk about in a bit, which are 2 and 3 feet long. So axons vary greatly in size, and neurons vary greatly in size and shape. So we're just going to talk about sort of the model neuron, if you will. All right. So if you look And remember, I suggested to you that neurons are one-way communication communicators. So if you're going from left to right of your screen, from dendrites, cell body, axon, terminal buttons, the information in your nervous system moves from left to right. DCBA is the way I think about it. Dendrites, cell body, axon. That's how information moves through a neuron. Okay, and you'll notice that this one neuron has a long axon and it goes all the way out, and you'll see at the right hand side of the screen is the next neuron that is communicating to. So you'll notice it's a one-way communication. Now, what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes is step back and talk about each of these parts of the neuron. On your test, I'm going to want you to, excuse me, I hit the wrong button. My fingers got a little busy here. Um, That's something for another class I was doing. Sorry about that. Um, what I'd like to do is talk about each of these parts of the neuron. And for the test, I'd like you to be able to match each part of the neuron with its function. Okay. And I may even give you a picture of a neuron on the exam and ask you to identify the parts. So please pay careful attention on the next couple of slides as we go over and talk about these different parts of the neuron. Okay, the first is the dendrites. You see on the far left-hand side of the screen. Notice how they look sort of like tree branches or roots, if you will. That's not a bad analogy because their job is to go out and to search for stimulation. They're ready to be stimulated by chemicals called neurotransmitters. So dendrites are branch-like structures that extend from the main cell body of the neuron. And they have hundreds or thousands of these little protein receptor sites, okay, on these dendritic spines that are sensitive to chemical stimulation. So these proteins are shaped such that when a specific chemical molecule shaped in just the right way is floating around, it connects with that little protein receptor site, and it causes that protein receptor site to generate a little bit of polarity. Okay, now each of these dendrites in these receptor sites, these hundreds or thousands of receptor sites, are of two types. Some of these receptor sites are excitatory, and some of these receptor sites are inhibitory. And I'll tell you what the difference between them is in just a minute. So the excitatory neurotransmitters, when they're activated by a chemical, they cause the neuron to be more likely to generate a pulse of electricity called an action potential. So some of these dendrites, when they're interacted with by a neurotransmitter chemical, they cause that neuron to want to send an action potential. However, there are hundreds or thousands of other dendritic spines or receptor sites, and some of these receptor sites are inhibitory. When they're activated by a molecule, they actually make the neuron less likely to become depolarized and send an action potential pulse of electricity. So, in a sense, if you think about it, you've got these hundreds or thousands of of receptor sites, and they're sampling the fluid around the neuron at any given time, comparing the number of excitatory impulses with inhibitory impulses. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please type a question in the chat bar. As I said, I've got those interactive videos and animations that'll kind of show you how this is working because I'm describing a dynamic process. So you've got these dendrites that are sensitive to chemicals. Now the chemicals are one of two types, excitatory or inhibitory. Now, the dendrites are connected to this thing called a cell body. This is the command center of the neuron. It takes care of all of the metabolic functions that you would typically expect a cell nucleus to take care of. So it's got ribosomes, it's got lysosomes, it's got your mitochondria, your DNA, all the stuff that you would typically find in a cell is in the cell body. However, the cell body also is, if you will, a vote counter. And what it's doing moment to moment, it is counting the number of excitatory impulses and the number of inhibitory chemical impulses that it is getting from the dendrites. If it gets enough excitatory impulses compared to inhibitory impulses, it generates a pulse of electrical activity. This occurs because of a depolarization in the cell membrane that really goes beyond this class. But basically, suffice to say, it generates a pulse of electricity, an action potential, which is going to travel down the length of this axon. See how long this axon is? It's like a root, if you will. It's going to generate this pulse of activity that's going to travel all the way down this axon to a different part of the brain or body where it's going to release chemicals that may stimulate the next neuron. I'm going to stop for just a second and look at Cosette. Any advice to best prepare for the exam? I would look at the homeworks, I would look at the videos, and I would definitely study the PowerPoints, Cosette. That's a really good question. By the way, I see we've got Sandra D'Erica in the house too. Welcome. Thanks for coming to lecture today. All right. So we've talked about the dendrites over here on the far left. They're sampling the fluid around the cell, looking for inhibitory and excitatory chemicals. They're then collecting information from these excitatory inhibitory neurotransmitters and sending it to the cell body. And the cell body, just like the vote counters in election, count the number of excitatory neurotransmitters compared to the inhibitory transmitters. If they get enough, they generate a pulse of electricity called an action potential. Okay? Now, let's talk about the action potential. It travels all the way down this long root-like structure called an axon. And this is how neurons communicate with different parts of the body. Some of these neurons are super duper short and only transmit information micrometers, if you will. On the other hand, if you've ever heard of your grandparents talking about their sciatic nerve, that actually has a neuron that's almost 3 feet long. So if you think about it, you can stimulate one part of your body, and then a pulse of electricity will travel 3 feet to a different part of your body to stimulate a different neuron. So these long root-like projections allow neurons to communicate from one place in your body to another place in your body. Now, again, I told you this action potential, this pulse of electricity is caused by a chemical depolarization on the cell membrane. If anybody truly needs something to do and want to come into a webinar Teams meeting, I would be more than happy to explain sodium and potassium pumps and depolarization in cell membranes, but I promise you it would bore most of you to death. All right. Now, so your axon, it's like a pulse of electricity. And in fact, you can put an EEG or put an EEG on your brain, and you can actually listen to, or actually, I would call it an event response potential. And you can measure event response potential, and you can actually listen to it. And it sounds like a Geiger counter as brain neurons are stimulated and they generate quick pulses of electricity. And it's kind of a neat thing. In fact, I think in the course resources folder, I have a sound animation of a neuron generating electrical pulses or action potentials. Now, here's the thing. An action potential is a pulse of electricity. And just like any other electrical device, it needs a coating so the wire doesn't short out. If you think about it, you've got 100 billion electrical wires in your brain. You probably know that with any electrical cord you have, they all have rubber on the outside. So when you plug in your laptop, you notice that your power cord has this plastic rubber coating on the outside of the wire. That's to protect the device from short circuiting. Just like that happens on with laptop wires, neurons in your brain have coatings on the areas that generate action potentials or electrical pulses in their brain. And the covering for your axons is called a myelin sheath. It's a fatty coating on the axons of larger neurons. It insulates the axon and actually speeds up the electrical impulse that is generated. And the reason that babies can't do much when they're born is because they don't have this insulative coating on the axons. As the axons grow this insulated coating on the outsides of them, the baby begins to take control of its behavioral abilities. So myelination is what causes these neurons to act properly and to allow you to engage in adult behavior. I don't know if any of you have heard of Lou Gehrig's disease, AMS, but that is what we call a demyelination disorder. There are some neurological disorders where this myelin sheath begins to die off, and this leads to loss of function and eventually death in a lot of people. Okay, so the myelin sheath is a fatty coating. It's composed of glial cells, and what people refer to as a nerve is actually a bundle of neurons. And if you look over here at the right, what I want you to see, it's sort of a graphical picture similar to the last scene. You'll notice little yellow wires are the axons. Around them are the gray coating of myelin sheath, and they're all in a bundle called a nerve. All right, so here we go. We've got these dendrites. They receive chemical stimulation in the form of neurotransmitters. These chemical stimulators are either telling them to generate electricity or not generate a pulse of electricity. The cell body decides whether or not it's going to generate an action potential based upon how many excitatory messages it gets from chemicals from neurons around the dendrites of that neuron. If it gets enough of them, it generates a pulse of electricity, which travels all the way from the cell body all the way to the other end of the neuron, wherever it may be. And it causes the terminal buttons at the end of that axon to dump their neurotransmitter molecules into these spaces between neurons called synapses. Synapses. So down at the terminal end, remember I told you with the dendrites, they're sensitive to chemical stimulation. Where do those chemicals come from? Well, those chemicals are actually in the terminal buttons in little receptacles, synaptic vesicles, that are locked in the terminal buttons. When stimulated by an action potential, these little terminal buttons open up, so to speak, and these neurotransmitter chemicals suffuse into the space outside. They leave the terminal button and float into the interstitial space. Now, it turns out that neurons and terminal buttons, or dendrites and terminal buttons, never touch. They actually have a space in between them, a little microscopic space. And that space is where the neurotransmitter is secreted. It comes out of let's see, the terminal button into the space where it can stimulate the next neurons, dendrites. Does that make sense? So the synapse, so no two neurons, even though you've got 100 billion of them and they're crammed into your brain, they actually don't touch. There's a little space. And so when this action potential travels all the way down the axon, it goes to the terminal buttons, and these terminal buttons release chemicals that then go into these spaces and stimulate the next neuron. Now, after stimulating the receptor site, okay, see slide 6, which we're going to talk about, the neurotransmitter is quickly cleared out of the synapse. So the crazy thing is neurotransmitters act locally and they act very quickly. So here's my terminal button. The chemical is dumped into my synapse. It stimulates the dendrite, and then that chemical is quickly cleared from that synapse. Now, it happens sort of two ways. The first way is the little molecules are actually sucked back up into the terminal button from where they came. This process is called reuptake. Reuptake. Okay? On the other hand, as I told you, glial cells clean interstitial uh, waste up. Well, that interstitial waste are extra neurotransmitters. So any extra neurotransmitters floating in the synapse are cleaned up uh, by glial cells and they're metabolized. So after stimulating the receptor site, the neurotransmitter is quickly cleared out of the synapse. Okay, Coslet, how do I make a Quizlet if I don't even know what will be on the exams? Uh, Cassette, this is where you're going to have to read the book. You're going to have to look at the review that I put, the little outcomes for each chapter, and you're going to have to look at the PowerPoints and sort of figure out what's important based upon what I'm lecturing about. It's going to be a little more challenging, I think, than you'll find in high school because we sort of expect you to be able to digest all of the material. You'll be able to figure it out. A chemical, a good one, good one. Imani asks about what do you mean by chemicals? I'm being a little bit vague because they're sometimes neurotransmitters and sometimes hormones. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But typically, what's secreted out of the terminal button is a neurotransmitter. Now, there are hormones, testosterone, estrogen, cortisol. These are what we call hormones. They work just like neurotransmitters, but instead of uh, being released by a terminal button, hormones are released by your glands in your body, and they float all over your body and affect tons of neurons. That's a great question, Imani. Great question. Okay. So here we go. Action potential causes the terminal button to release transmitters, chemical messengers into the synapse. So if you'll notice these little red dots down here are actually neurotransmitter chemicals. They're being released into the synapse, and you'll see that we have these blue protein receptors that happen to be shaped just so that these neurotransmitters fit into them, and this is what causes either excitatory or inhibitory uh, messages to the postsynaptic receptor site. Okay. Now, neurotransmitters, molecules released from neurons that communicate with other neurons. They're released by neurons and they communicate with just the neurons in the local area. Scientists have identified over 100 neurotransmitters. Um, but we're in introductory classes, we typically only focus on about 7 neurotransmitters because they do 95% of the work. Learn these for the test. Okay. Now, some of these neurotransmitters, when they suffuse into a synapse, they are excitatory. That is, they cause the next neuron to be more likely to generate an action potential. Some of these chemicals, on the other hand, are primarily inhibitory. And so when they are secreted by the terminal button into the synapse, they cause the next neuron to become inhibited or to become less likely to send an action potential. And the crazy thing is, some neurotransmitters can either be excitatory or inhibitory depending upon where they are released. Okay, I'm going to stop real quickly and take and comment. Anna F., if you'll look in each weekly chapter, you'll notice there are learning outcomes, 5 to 6 learning outcomes related to that chapter. Those actually represent the study guide for the topic. Here in college, especially as you move up into more senior level classes, Anna, don't expect uh, detailed study guides all the time. One of the things that college is trying to train you to do, that they will do by the time you get to your senior level classes, is they're not going to provide as much support. The whole point of the college education is that you sort of learn to you become able to learn independently. So we're going to start pulling away some of the supports as you move upwards in your uh, college degree. Okay, is it glitching for a lot of people or just for Cosette? Okay, now, here are the ones you're going to know. Acetylcholine is a motor neurotransmitter. It affects your attention, your memory, your learning, and most importantly, your muscle control. When you get bit by a black widow spider, that latrotoxin is what we call an acetylcholine agonist. It causes your acetylcholine to work too well, and it causes your muscles to start twitching and spasming. So, latrotoxin, which is contained in the black widow spider uh, black widow spider venom, actually works on your acetylcholine receptors. Now, the second neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. I don't know if you've ever heard of noradrenaline, epinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, adrenaline. These are all sort of the same family of chemicals. We're going to call it norepinephrine for the test. This is primarily an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it increases your level of arousal. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. If any of you have ever been diagnosed with clinical depression, EpiPens, there you go, Trevor. Fantastic. Exactly, exactly. Um, Serotonin is a mood regulating neurotransmitter. If you've ever been diagnosed as clinically depressed, if you've ever taken Zoloft, or one of those other depression medicines, what you're trying to do is to increase your level of serotonin levels. Increase the serotonin level in your brain. Serotonin is really responsible for mood regulation and emotional states. Uh, the fourth neurotransmitter is dopamine. This is the neurotransmitter that is important in the reward and motivation regulation. So when you do something that feels good, your brain is getting a dose of dopamine, which trains you to go back and do whatever it is you were doing. So when you eat and it feels good, boom, you get a dopamine rush. When you have sex and it feels good, boom, you get a dopamine rush. Unfortunately, addictive drugs, activate the dopamine in your brain, which causes them to be addictive because you keep doing the drugs so you can get this dose of dopamine in your nervous system. So it turns out that some people with too little dopamine actually, let's see, B12 supplement is supposed to help moods as well. B12 is going to act more globally. I'm not sure exactly the mechanism of B12. Uh, Anna, that's a great question, and you've stumped me because I don't know much about B12, but I'm sure it probably works in your nervous system to stimulate serotonin functioning. That's a great question. So dopamine. Dopamine actually also smooths out your motor movements. If you've ever seen somebody with what does Michael J. Fox have? Shaky Dad, where you shake. Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's disease don't create enough dopamine in their nervous system, and it causes their hand to shake because dopamine is sort of smooths out your motor movements. Okay, dopamine, not dopamine. The drugs are responsible for the addiction, but they cause the addiction because they activate the dopamine receptor sites. Yes, SR Imani, that's a great question. And if you go to Mouse Party in my course resources folder, there are a couple of really cool animations showing you how cocaine and other drugs act on dopamine circuits to cause people to become addicted. That's a great, that's a great question. Okay, GABA aminobutyric acid. No GABA, that's much easier. If you've ever been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, if you've ever taken Xanax, uh, you are trying to change the functioning of your levels of GABA in your brain. GABA is primarily an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and GABA is responsible for maintaining relaxation. People who have low levels of GABA in their brain tend to have anxiety issues. So you take things like Xanax to increase the level of GABA in your nervous system, which causes a feeling of calm. If you drink a bunch of alcohol, that actually increases the GABA functioning in your brain as well and causes you to be intoxicated and relax. Yes, the slides I'm going through are a PowerPoint. Actually, I have the wrong ones uploaded with the lecture today. I'm going to go back and change those after the class. That's a great question, Gustavo. All right, now let's see. Glutamate is mostly an excitatory neurotransmitter. It enhances the functioning of action potentials, and it's most responsible for learning and memory. As you're learning, hopefully you're remembering what I'm talking today. Glutamate is being released from your terminal buttons, and it's strengthening nerve pathways that hold your memory. And then endorphins. Endorphins were actually the first neurotransmitter discovered, um, and they were named that because they had functions similar to morphine. And somebody said, hey, this is an endogenous morphine like substance. So they called them endorphins. But endorphins really are responsible for pain reduction. If any of you have ever been a runner, and you know it sucks to run for the first couple of miles, but then all of a sudden you get what's known as the runner's high when your body starts to feel good. Those are the endorphins being released from your body, reducing the pain in your body. And endorphins are also a part of the reward circuit in your brain that lead to the process of addiction. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Your brain and nervous system are protected from most outside chemicals because the functioning between your synapses, between your terminal buttons and your dendrites, has to happen very, very carefully. Right? So your brain actually has this fatty layer called the blood-brain barrier that filters out all the molecules and chemicals trying to get into your brain so that your synapses function properly. However, there are a class of drugs that are small enough to fit through that blood brain barrier and are shaped just like the neurotransmitters released in your brains. And these chemicals are what we might call neuromodulating chemicals. All right. Now, you can think of neurotoxins like black widow spider. That's a poison that can get into your nervous system. If you drink alcohol, smoke marijuana, take prescription medication for an anxiety disorder. All of these things are what we call neuromodulating chemicals because they can get into your nervous system and they are shaped similar to a lot of times they are shaped similar to the neurotransmitters. Not all of them, some of them work different ways. Again, too complex. I don't want to go into the details in this class. But these are chemicals small enough to pass through the blood brain barrier that alter the effect of neurotransmitter functioning. And they have two primary effects. Two primary effects. Some of them are agonists, that is, they get into the brain and they magnify the effect of a neurotransmitter. And some of these chemicals are antagonists, that is, they get into the nervous system and they minimize the effect of a neurotransmitter. Let me give you a couple examples. If any of you have taken Zoloft or any other SSRI, you are taking what's known as a serotonin agonist. SSRI actually stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Reuptake inhibitor. It prevents the serotonin from being sucked back into the terminal button, so your serotonin keeps sending messages to these receptor sites. So, in a sense, Zoloft as an SSRI magnifies the amount of serotonin that exists in your brain, like you have more. On the other hand, Thorazine, which is typically given for people who have psychotic disorders, who have schizophrenia and other delusional disorders. These people are usually given Thorazine. And Thorazine is a dopamine antagonist. What it does is it decreases the function of the dopamine in your nervous system, and it reduces the delusions and hallucinations that people with schizophrenia have. So we think that schizophrenia and other delusional disorders are associated with overproduction of dopamine. So people take Thorazine, and that decreases the effectiveness of the Thorazine in their nervous system. Hope that makes sense. All right. Uh, One final thing that I did want to say, we're running about out of time. So, neurotransmitters, so neurons are these structures that communicate chemically and electrically. And each of these neurons releases chemicals that affect the neurons in a very localized area. However, these are not the only chemicals that affect our neuromodulating functions. We actually have this other class of chemicals called hormones that work just like neurotransmitters. The only difference is the two differences being instead of being released locally in one specific area of your brain, hormones are released from these glands that you have in your body. And instead of just going to the next neuron, they're released into your blood and they circulate through your system and they affect all of the neurons in your body. So they're chemicals released into the bloodstream and they work slow instead of fast and they work systemically instead of locally. What are some examples that we're going to talk about later on in this semester? Well, when we get to human sexuality, we're going to talk about testosterone and estrogen, which are two chemicals released by the gonads, the ovaries or the testes, depending on whether or not you're male or female. And they influence your sexual development, your sexual feelings, and your sexual behavior. When we're in chapter 11, talking about stress and coping, we're going to be talking about cortisol, which is a hormone that is released when you get scared or anxious. And cortisol has both some positive and some negative implications for your body functioning. So we talk about stress kills. Well, the cortisol that courses through your body is good in the short term, but actually affects your body adversely in the long term. Okay, some general review notes. Remember from slide 3, neurons are one-way communicators. Either they send information to the nervous system or they receive information to the periphery of your body, to your peripheral nervous system, or they receive information, right? And we talk about afferent and efferent, or we talk about motor and sensory neurons. When action potentials, these pulses of electricity are generated, they travel all the way down the axon and they cause the terminal buttons to release all of the chemicals they have. Not a few of their chemicals, not half of their chemicals, but they dump all of them. Okay? Remember, neurotransmitters may cause the next neuron to be either excited and want to send an action potential, or they may cause the next neuron to be relaxed and not want to send an action potential. And remember, as I said, whether or not the generation of an action potential occurs depends upon the ratio of excitatory messages compared to inhibitory messages that a cell body in a neuron receives. Okay, you know what? That's all I have to say about the structure and functioning of the neuron. Now, today we talked about the basic building block, that one little part, that 1 in 100 million part of your nervous system. So we have 100 million neurons. Today we talked about how each one of those neurons functions in a general way. What I'm going to do on Thursday is I'm going to talk about how neurons communicate to different parts of the brain, and I'm going to talk about the different areas of the brain. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that you can think of a brain as hundreds of different small computers that are all stuck together, each one doing a different activity. And we're going to talk about how these modules connect to one another and create the complex behavior that makes you a functioning human being. Do we have any questions about today's lecture? It's 9:53, so we've gone, we're about 2 minutes early, which is good. Do we have any quick questions? Let's see. I believe so. Dopamine responsible for addiction. Yes. The slides you're going through a PowerPoint. If you have any, if you go to the lessons, yes. The PowerPoints. Yeah. Okay. We've got a bunch of questions about the PowerPoints. Hopefully everybody can find the PowerPoints. All right, folks. I hope you have a great day. Don't forget to get started on your discussion board. Remember, you can open this week's homework up and spend all the time you want looking at the lecture and doing the chapter. Now, do keep in mind, while I don't have, I not only do I provide review notes at the beginning of each chapter. Somebody was asking about a review. But on the Friday before the exam is due, I am going to go over the exam in detail. I'm not actually going to tell you the questions or the answers, but I'm going to say, hey, you need to know this. Hey, you need to know this. Hey, you need to know this. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of direction for the final exam. Okay? You folks have a great day, and I can't wait to see you tonight in the webinar. Take care.